All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Justice in Jobs Worth a Second Chance webinar. My name's Andrew Ewell. I'm the General Manager of Strategic Communication and Engagement at Jesuit Social Services, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We will get going in just a few moments, but first, just a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this session, so we can share it with those who registered but were unable to make it to today's event, and we'll email that recording out to you tomorrow. We do have an interactive discussion that will be happening as part of this event a little bit later on in the event, and we do have the Q&A function available throughout the webinar. Perhaps save your questions until a little bit later on when we have heard from each of the panelists first. We'll then go into that panel discussion. So use the Q&A function for that, and the chat function, you're very welcome to use that to discuss anything that you're hearing today, anything you want to mention as part of the conversation. We are also using closed captions for this event, so if you want to turn those on, you can find the button, the closed caption button down the bottom of the screen. They're usually pretty good at picking up the speech, but every now and then we do find that names and a few details do get lost in translation. So we will have a staff member who is updating some of those details in the chat function. So you might want to keep an eye on the chat function. If you miss something in the closed captions or something's not clear, we will try and write that in the chat function. All right, I would now like to hand over to Auntie Di Kerr, who's going to do a welcome to country for us, recognising that people are joining us today from a number of different traditional lands. I myself am on Wurundjeri land, as are a number of our panellists, and the central office of Jesuit Social Services is on Wurundjeri land. So we have invited Wurundjeri Elder Auntie Di to be with us today to do a welcome to country. So I'll hand over now to you, Auntie Di.
Thank you very much. I honour my ancestors and my elders, and I pay homage to all the sacred grounds that we're on. I wish to acknowledge any elders of different nations, any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, any First Nation peoples from across the waters, and I acknowledge you all, and I pay my respects to your ancestors, elders and families. It's an honour and a privilege to be able to do your welcome today on behalf of my grandmother, mother and ancestors. And it's the topic that you're doing is important to all of us, you know, and a lot of people, young ones, older ones, are forgotten people in the justice system, and they do need help and they need to be nurtured, because sometimes when they come out from being incarcerated, they go back to where they were living before, and they go back into the circle again and of the community and end up in trouble again. So as well as looking at employment, we need to look at housing and education for them as well. I want to thank you all for doing the work that you do. That's important. It's important we look after our vulnerable communities, and sometimes you don't get a thank you, and it's sometimes you just need that thanks to keep you going. And it's important that we look after each other, share our stories, listen to each other and learn each other's culture, because then we can live in harmony. When we live in harmony, we eradicate racism and stigma, and we pave the way for our younger ones, our future leaders. They can live in peace and walk our streets without fear of any harm. So I'd like to offer you all my hand in friendship so that we can journey together. May Bunjil, my creator, surround you all and give you strength and resilience. On behalf of my elders, I say Wominjeka, Wurundjeri, Balak, Yemen Bik, which means welcome to Wurundjeri country. For those of you that are zooming in from different country, Aboriginal country, I can't welcome you to the country you're on, but I can acknowledge the country that you're on and hope that their ancestors give you strength and resilience. So I say Nungoj, and that means thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey today, and have a wonderful day. Nungoj.
Thank you, Arnie Dyer. That was a really wonderful welcome to country, and it feels very special to have you with us today. And it's a great reminder too. We're focused on employment pathways and what a job can offer young people today, but a great reminder that that's just one part of the puzzle, and that housing and education and connection to family and community and culture is also a really important building blocks and really important piece of that sort of web of relationships that we talk about at Jesuit Social Services that holds us all. We need all of those to be strong to really flourish. It's fantastic to have so many people with us today. This is the second Worth Second Chance webinar that we've held this year, and we will continue to hold these as a way to really dig into these really difficult and complex issues and find positive ways that we can influence a justice system that is more effective and more humane and helps young people acknowledge and take responsibility for their actions, but also move forward with support on a really positive life path. In a moment, we'll hear from our expert panel about that. But first, something that's really important to us at Jesuit Social Services is to always hear the lived experience of the young people who are going through this. And so in just a moment, we're going to play you a video of a young man, Mustafa, who had some major challenges in his life when he was younger and made some pretty significant mistakes, but shares with us a bit of his story about how he experienced that and where he's at now in his life, and the importance to him of being able to get a job and what that means to him. So I'll stop talking and I will throw over to Mustafa now to tell his story.
I couldn't believe it that I could actually get a job with my criminal record, because I did some really bad stuff when I was unwell. So it was just, I was so happy. So I was a door knocker for solar panels. I was doing lead generation, so just making appointments for people slightly interested in buying a solar panel system. I was a team leader. I did that for a couple of years. It was really good until I went downhill. Once I got over my hiccups of justice and my mental health and stuff, I just really wanted to get back into it. But a lot of the prerequisites were a criminal check, so that was always in my head. It was just stopping me from thinking that I could secure employment. It just made me feel like, I'm not gonna, what's the point? It made me feel like giving up and just staying on Centrelink for the rest of my life. And I was like, am I really gonna do this? Not, because I just kept trying for the jobs that I wanted. It made me feel hopeless, and it made me feel like I couldn't be part of society because of my past, and I didn't want to be defined by my past. I was like really stuck. So I'm really grateful for my community corrections officer and the program at Jesuit. Jesuit believes in giving people a second chance, and that there is hope, and people do look beyond your past and see you for who you are now. And like the people that work with Jesuit and hiring people with a past with justice, just it really gave me so much hope. I was over the moon, very happy. He's a really humble, professional, supportive person. He's a really good boss, Randall is. And I just felt like, if everything was going to be okay. It's a great team. They just saw me for who I am today. He asked me briefly about my past, but he wasn't judgmental at all. He made me feel like a normal person who deserves a second chance, and I'm forever grateful for him. I work on the roads of Victoria, Melbourne, keeping pedestrians safe and doing traffic management and control around roadworks. It's really, really good. It's rewarding. I enjoy it. It's challenging. It's really good. Yeah. I feel like there's hope. I have faith, and I feel organized and productive, and I feel a part of something bigger than me, like a part of a team. They made a mistake, but look at who they are today and the changes that they've made, and give them a second chance and see how hard they'll put their heart and energy and hard work and good work ethic into your company, because it's just good to not judge and just give someone a go and give hope to people, because how good you're giving hope to someone that they are a part of society now, instead of being stuck to their past and just causing more problems in life that is not good for society. We need people to be empowered, move on, become different people.
I really want to thank Mustafa for sharing his story with us. And as Auntie Di, in fact, spoke about as well, it's when we sort of share our stories that we can build our understanding. And I think, Mustafa really expresses a lot in that short video about what we're trying to achieve through Worth Second Chance, and a lot of the work that Jesuit Social Services and many other organisations are doing to help young people again, sort of accept, responsibility for what's happened in the past, but to move forward really positively. And I think it's a really interesting point Mustafa makes there about not looking at the mistakes a person's made in the past, but instead at who they are today and the effort and enthusiasm they could put into a job and more broadly into community life. But as Mustafa also said, people who have been involved with the justice system do face some really significant challenges before they can even get into work. This might be sort of partly around, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. It might also sometimes be about really practical things, like some sort of crippling concern that applying for a job will involve a criminal history check, which can stop people from even putting themselves forward. That said, we know a job can deliver so much. Work gives structure, it gives purpose, stability, income, and also an identity away from offending. But just 1 in 5 people leave prison into a job. And things are even tougher for young people. In Australia, young people are more than twice as likely to be unemployed than adults. And finding work as a young person with a criminal record is really hard. But also maintaining that job is difficult. There might be a lot of complexity going on in your life, from complex and difficult family relations potentially, or moving between houses, finding your feet again in a new life after leaving the justice system. All of these things can make concentrating on work itself very difficult. So there's a lot of different sort of things to unpick here around how we deliver support to young people to make this possible. I want to introduce our first panelist now to get us sort of deeper into this. We had lined up for Mustafa's boss, Randall, to join us today, who would have given us some great insight around why he, as an employer, has become a great advocate for employing people with previous contact with the criminal justice system. Unfortunately for us, probably fortunately for Randall, he's very busy. As I said, unfortunately, he's been called away on some pretty urgent business. We are really pleased, though, to have with us, and I'm eternally grateful that Cheryl Landolina has joined us in place of Randall. Cheryl works with Jesuit Social Services employment programs supporting employers like Randall to bring staff into his projects. And this includes, as part of Cheryl's role, advocating for employees with criminal records and providing both the employer and the job seeker with the support they need to make that job a success and to make that a success in the long term. So Cheryl, I'd now like to invite you to give us a little bit of insight into employers' attitudes towards hiring people with a criminal record and their experience that they have through that process, and also perhaps the support they need as part of that process.
Okay, thanks very much for the lovely introduction, Andrew. I'm lucky enough to have a role that focuses on major projects and construction, and the major projects actually have an obligation written into their contractual requirements to meet social procurement requirements. And I'd like to share the definition of social procurement with you. Social procurement is when organisations use their buying power to generate social value above and beyond the value of goods, services, or construction being preferred. So social value above and beyond the value of goods and services. I think it's beautiful. And under the Victorian Government social procurement framework, all major projects are required to purchase goods and services from social enterprises and Aboriginal-owned businesses, and they must achieve social inclusion targets by hiring disadvantaged job seekers. As a very minimum, 10% of all the hours performed and worked on a project have to be performed by apprentices, trainees and cadets. So this provides a lot of opportunities for people that need training on the job. And 3% of the hours must be performed by workers who fit under social inclusion cohorts. And under our JVS contract, we refer to these as priority job seekers. And these include job seekers who've been incarcerated or who have had justice involvement. And in addition to that, 1.5% as a minimum of the hours on each project must be performed by workers who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. The targets vary from project to project. It can depend on what they bid for, what they said they would do, but they're the minimum requirements underpinning it. For example, prison construction projects may have specific targets for employing ex-offenders, and social housing projects have specific targets for employing public tenants. More recently, high targets have been set for female inclusion on the major projects. So Momentum Traffic Control are a subcontractor as a traffic control company to many major projects. And we were asked by a level crossings removal project to give them a call. They felt they needed help in meeting their social inclusion targets. And at that time, they weren't meeting them, and only 2% of their workforce were priority job seeker cohorts from priority job seeker cohorts. In 1999, at the college, Rob was managing a program at the time that was called First Time and Young Offenders. And at the end of, during 1999, we set some targets to get pledges from tier 1 construction companies and their subcontractors to take on first time and young offenders. So it came to Christmas of 1999. I went and had a visit with Randall, took the lovely hamper and got some feedback on the 30 people that we'd already placed with him, and asked him to pledge that he would take on, I wanted him to pledge to take on 3 people from ex-offending cohorts. He agreed to take 1. And then in May 2020, our first young ex-offender who'd had interaction, she'd just come out of Dame Phyllis Frost. She was 19 years of age. She was the first person that started with them. She had an ankle bracelet on when she started. We provided lots of contact and support. They put her with a mum type mentor supervisor, and all the feedback that we received was absolutely fantastic. And at the end of August 2020, she had her ankle bracelet removed, and they had an afternoon tea to celebrate her achievement. Then her boyfriend got released from jail, and they decided to hire him as well. And then they started sending them on jobs together. They got great feedback from the major projects, and then the project specifically requested them. They were so happy with them. So on the strength of that, they issued them with a company ute. And I'd have to say the keys to success that they gave them were acceptance, trust, responsibility, and positive feedback. And their feedback to us was working for Randall was like being part of a big family. They were trusted, they were given opportunity, and they didn't want to mess it up. Very pleased to say that whilst Momentum came from a low base of 2% of employees, they now have over 20% of their workforce who come from social inclusion cohorts. 22 of those are ex-offenders and 20 of them were placed there by us. I mentioned briefly the building equality policy, where all of construction have to increase significantly their female participation. Momentum has a 52% female workforce. We have many examples of people that we've placed with Momentum, but I think the turning point for Momentum Traffic Control wasn't just taking two great young people. We took him out on a visit to Ravenhall, and he met with some people at the prison. He spoke to two groups of them. It was just so beautiful to watch their eyes light up, and the hope that you could see in their eyes. When you go for an interview with Momentum, it's a little bit intimidating. You've got one person who's got a bit of a colourful history and the other one who's a former Victorian policeman. So we tell our participants, don't lie when you go for the interview, tell them the truth, tell them what your parole conditions are, be upfront because otherwise they'll spot it. And I think my 5 minutes might already be up, Andrew. Is that correct?
This is a very subtle prompt, Cheryl. That
yes.
I love hearing the stories, and we're going to hear more from you later. We're going to have a chance
to
dig
do
in
that then. Thank you.
and ask some questions. But I love a couple of points there. That's people. You're not only encouraging them not to lie, but they get to own the fact that that is their history, and that's okay, and they can move forward with that. And I also like the fact that that Randall and perhaps the other senior staff from Momentum took the invitation up to go to the prison and to start to, I guess, break down their own stereotypes or understanding of of the othering of people who are in contact with the criminal justice system. So there's some really great points there. Thank you. I'll now invite our second panelist up with us, and we're very fortunate to have Anushka Geronimus with us today. Anushka is a very good friend of Jesuit Social Services, but Anushka is also the director of the Youth Law Program at West Justice. West Justice do some fantastic work with young people, and I'll let Anushka talk a bit more about that, and also have a fantastic campaign called Target Zero, which has the absolutely sensational target of having 0 young people in that area in contact with the criminal justice system. Anushka has previously spent 13 years working at Victorian Legal Aid in the Youth Legal Service and Youth Crime Team, and in 2012 was awarded the Children's Law Award for work she led in relation to the Tyler Cassidy inquest. Anushka has a deep interest in the rights of young people in conflict with the law and is committed to effective advocacy on their behalf. So welcome, Anushka.
Thanks, Andrew. I thought I might talk, given what Cheryl's very helpfully set the scene in terms of helping young people to get a job once they've been in the system, just going back to what being in the system kind of means for a person, some kind of, just from a starting perspective, what we know, and I think Auntie Di, with that beautiful acknowledgement at the welcome at the beginning, kind of talked about, is that Aboriginal children and young people in residential care, and Australian multicultural children and young people, especially those from African and Pacifica backgrounds, are chronically overrepresented in the justice system. In terms of kids, we know that in terms of being in custody, we know that a number of them are on a child protection order, a number of them, 66.2, had a history of trauma, abuse and neglect. A number had alcohol and other drug use. A number were affected by alcohol and other drug use when committing an offence. and a significant 50% were accessing mental health support at the time of their entry into custody. And this is for the under 18s. These types of statistics aren't captured for the over 18, so it's something also for us to bear in mind in terms of a future advocacy ask. And also that means what about the other 50% in terms of needing mental health support? Also in 2019-20, we also know that 68% were recorded as being suspended or expelled from school. Now, they don't capture the unemployment or employment rate of young people on entry into the justice system, but we also know that young people, Andrew, you mentioned it, are disproportionately affected by unemployment as compared to other age groups. And even before the COVID crisis, and I know that everybody's talking about the lowest rate of employment at the moment, but even with the new ABS data, it's important for us to look behind to see actually who is employed, who's underemployed, and what is happening for our young people. And that prior to COVID-19, the youth unemployment rate for young people was 11.8% compared to the general unemployment rate. So it's something, it's a really important context. And we know that for some people, it's even harder to get a job. In terms of the system itself, once a young person enters the criminal justice system and comes into contact with it, and here we're talking about police contact as well as court contact. The reality for many, in my experience and the experience of many of those who support young people in conflict with the law, it's very hard to stay out of the system. It's often referred to as quicksand. Hence why prevention is such an important plank of our collective efforts and strategy to improve the life outcomes of young people in Victoria, and also as part of that, improving community safety. Because of in terms of the difficulty of them staying out of the system, it's because they have they experience a lot of the issues that I've just kind of touched on, and the impacts of those. So physical and mental health issues, economic safety issues, but not just for them, but their families as well, plus systemic discrimination. That means it's more easy for them to come into contact with the system, and then harder for them to stay out. So we've talked about the importance of prevention, but once you're in the system, and because of the fact that it's so difficult to stay out, that's where the Jesuits' Worth a Second Chance campaign and is in particular the employment program becomes so important, because then the focus must shift to supporting young people to come out of the system as quickly as possible. And this is done by helping them to address their offending behaviour and engaging meaningfully in activities that will promote their rehabilitation and also deepen their insight into what got them into trouble in the first place, and ideally stay out. One of the things about young people, and we've talked about it, it's often talked about, I'm sure it was talked about at the last webinar, is that young people's brains are not fully formed and continue to develop up until at least 25, but now the latest evidence is that it's later than that, which means that their ability to think first and then act is developmentally limited. One of the things about the system then is, once you're in the system, what happens then if you are found guilty is that you then have a criminal record. And having a criminal record, the law kind of talks about when you need to get one. You've got quite detailed sentencing laws for both young people under 18 but over 18, which talks about how to sentence them, what factors to take into account. But the long story short is that if you take responsibility and plead guilty, you get a sentence. And sometimes that sentence is with conviction or without. What that means in plain terms is that that's quite a significant legal and social censure. It's a real mark that you have got into trouble, and the court takes this very seriously, and now you have to deal with that fact. And then going back to what Cheryl was talking about in terms of being honest and kind of declaring to employers that you have this record, makes it all the more difficult to get a job. And And this is a reality for people who found it hard to get a job before they came into the system. And so what that then means is that helping people through employment becomes such an important focus when we're talking about meaningful reintegration. And one of the other important things is, because of all of the issues and what they experience going into custody, that companion piece about the social support and the youth work support, in addition to the employment, helps them to not just get a job, but keep that job, and then also to progress, ideally upwards through that, through that employment kind of opportunities.
Thanks, Anushka. That's some really great points there. And I think that point about the justice system often being a bit like quicksand, that people, once they come into even just a little bit of contact with it, can be drawn in deeper, and it can be harder and harder without the right support to sort of extricate yourself from that. And we also know that it's not always a single process to get your life on a different path either. It can be 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, and 3 steps forward and 1 step back for a number of time, and that support's really important. That's fantastic. Thank you. I'll now introduce our next speaker, and perhaps I think follows on really well when we're talking about the sort of support and the sort of challenges that a lot of young people are facing that were outlined so well by Anushka there. The contact in terms of, the experience of mental health, the drug and alcohol abuse at times, the experience of abuse, a whole range of sort of things that can be going on in a young person's life. We know that there needs to be support for that young person in a whole lot of ways so that they can concentrate on be it their education, a training pathway, or employment, so they can be on a more positive path. So I now want to introduce Jess Wikira, who is a worker with Jesuit Social Services, an intensive support worker for Maori and Pacifica young people who are involved with the justice system. Jez has more than 20 years experience working in the youth and family sectors, and extensive cultural support with First Nations people from New Zealand, Pacifica Islands, Hawaii, and other parts of North America. So Jess is going to talk to us about the support young people need in their lives so they can focus on those sort of positive future pathways. So welcome, Jess.
Hey, thank you for that introduction. I agree with Anushka. I'm glad that she set the scene for what I'm about to present. I hope that my presentation will give you a perspective from the grassroots. So I'm part of the Youth Justice Community Support Service based in Dandenong. I'm part of the Southern team. And so we are a diverse team, and we have an integrated approach to supporting young people that come through the youth justice system through the department. Our cohort typically are between the ages of 10 and 21. And so our main priority is to support our young people to link them into family, culture, identity, health, housing, education and training, and employment, and other developmental pathways that they can have. So the Youth Justice Support Service in Dandenong, we have 2 teams that are made up of the day team, which operate between the hours of 9 to 5 p.m. weekly, and we have an after hours team which operate between 2:30 and 10:30 p.m. at night over 7 days. And with the team, we're able to provide support during not only during operating hours, but during the after hours, which is like a crisis period also for young people that need support. So we try to wrap around in that service. Part of my role is also cultural connections. So as was shared, I also work with Māori Pacifica young people that are in the youth justice system. But overall, I suppose what we understand and what we experience as support workers is we know that getting our young people onto the pathway towards education, training, and employment, we know that that's the real catalyst to positive change for our young people and long-term change. But it's not that easy. It's not a quick fix in terms of getting our young people into employment. It's not as simple as connecting them to an employment service and getting them a job or applying for a job. We know that there are massive barriers and massive challenges that our young people face. And many of them are things like education, housing, health, even family issues, so substance abuse. So a lot of these different challenges our young people face. So when we're bringing them onto that pathway, that positive pathway, we know that 30% of our participants are not engaged in education, training and employment, as was spoken before me. So we can understand some of those statistics, but like I said, the positive pathway to employment is where we want to get our young people, but that's the hard bit. Because we're faced with so many different challenges and barriers, it really is about practical approach, like practical supports for our young people. And it's basic things like even just being able to get them photo ID, a birth certificate, a tax file number, all of those things to help them operate within the system or navigate the system for employment. There are other barriers and challenges. One of the other challenges that our young people face, particularly Māori and Pacific young people, is their immigration status. So many of our young people were either born in New Zealand or they were born here and made citizens by descent with their parents. So this means that they hold a 444 visa, and this allows them to go to school, to work, to access Medicare, but they're unable to access any financial support. So they've got no access to Centrelink, to things like youth allowance. And so this is another barrier which kind of condenses a lot of the issues in support accessibility. So in terms of our young people trying to navigate to get onto this positive path, it's quite difficult. And so many of our team members as support workers, there's a lot of stuff like mentoring. We rely a lot also on the referral pathways to different support services. And this helps our young people get onto a positive path. It helps them access some kind of financial support where they can do education, training, possibly access work gear and things like that, complete white cards if they want to enter into building and construction. So it's not that simple. There's a lot of different barriers that we face trying to get our young people. A lot of it's self-esteem, confidence. A lot of them didn't have a really good experience in education. Some have learning difficulties. There's trauma background, there's all those types of things. So it's really important once we get them onto this path that we can connect them to the right referrals and support services, and continue to do that right till they're able to secure employment. So I've been able to do that with some young people, get them some employment secured in the last year. I've got 4 young men that are working full-time, 2 of which are on apprenticeships, and 2 full-time as well. So that's the success of what employment can do as a catalyst for our young people to get onto that positive path.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Jess. It sounds like, I'm always amazed hearing people like yourself talk about your work. It sounds like such a difficult and interesting mix of some of that sort of intangible work around connection to culture and building self-esteem, as well as those really practical things about just getting your license, getting the things, the birth certificate and the things that you need to be able to move around in the community like a lot of us probably take for granted. That's some great examples there, and I'm looking forward to sort of digging into the conversation a bit more in a moment. Before we get there, I will introduce our 4th panel member, Rob Auger. So Rob has worked in employment training and education for more than 10 years and is passionate about the role employment opportunity plays in social inclusion, so making sure people are able to take part. Rob's going to speak to us now about some of the programs and initiatives that are around to specifically help young people get into work, and also about some of the changes that perhaps we still need so that we can see job seekers and employers able to make these things happen more often and make it a success too. I think everything that we're talking about today is not just about getting young people into work, but it's about making sure that both the employer and the young person are supported properly so that it can be a successful placement. So welcome to you, Rob.
Thanks, Andrew. And look, I have to say as well, it's incredibly heartening to hear some of the work that everyone's doing, and particularly Jasmine, the last panelist. A lot of people, I think, have this perception that, you know, if you just get somebody a job, everything will be fine. And Jasmine clearly understands, as probably to many of us, that there's a lot of things that have to happen in the background, not just to get the person into a job, but if those things aren't in place, the likelihood of success in that role, of flourishing in that role and being able to stay in that role is much lower. So some of that background work that's done before a participant or a young person gets handed over to an employment program is crucial. And that's where some of our employment programs will start to take over. So if some of those issues are being addressed, then we can work with intensive support workers. We'll start working on more of the perhaps vocational barriers, also self-confidence and understanding of how to operate in the application process, interview process, and then ultimately in the workplace. So if we do place a young person into work, we also stay alongside them for the first 6 months of employment to make sure that they can troubleshoot any issues they've got, upskill, extra tickets, licensing, etc. We run a specialist ex-offenders program, and that's for people who are trying to access employment, that have obviously had interactions with the justice background or are recently been released from prison. We have a really good success rate. We've placed over 140 people since July 2021, and that was through 5 months of COVID. So we think that's no mean feat. We're pretty happy with it. But I don't want to rabbit on, I suppose, about the programs. I wanted to talk about probably what some of the significant barriers are that we're still seeing in terms of trying to open up doors for young people or ex-offenders of any age. And it's a bit of a systemic problem. I thought I'd bring it up because I think it probably invokes conversation. And my hope is as well that, you know, we can all come away from it and take advocacy roles ourselves. And if we're working with people who are in that space, teach them how to self-advocate. So a couple of things that Anushka had pointed out, and I believe Cheryl as well, and Jasmine, is once somebody is in a situation where they have offended and they've appeared before a magistrate or they've gotten caught up in the system, unfortunately, that offense, whatever it is, with conviction or without conviction, will show up on a police check. I know that earlier, I believe this year was very late last year, the spent conviction scheme was introduced. So in theory, if you're a young person, within 5 years, if there's no reoffending history, then whatever you've done is going to be wiped from your police check. If you're an adult offender, 10 years, I believe, is the case. And that's well and good. It's something that should be applauded. But I thought I'd bring up the idea that there's still barriers in place. So even spent convictions will show up on a police check if somebody ticks the box working unsupervised with vulnerable people. Now, we might think, okay, well, that only applies to social work roles or teaching roles or working in a school. And those protections are important. They're in place to make sure that, you know, there's no risk for the people that we look after in some of these environments. But these can be applied to tradies working in schools, somebody doing, you know, fixing the cable or the internet going into a childcare center, whatever the case may be. Those applications could be put forward, and I suppose through experience, because we work with this in the employment space, we'll see things from 10 years, 15 years ago as minor offenses. You know, if you stole a Kit Kat bar, if you had a DUI or a speeding infraction, or you were jailed because you couldn't pay your fines. If you tick the right box, it's there. Spent conviction or no spent conviction. And so this is something that I wanted to sort of bring up because this is a major barrier. And it's something that needs to be addressed on a level of self-advocacy in terms of participants and young people or ex-offenders trying to enter the workforce. But I think as all of us who are attending here, I think we've got similar minds. That's why we're here. We should start talking to businesses that we interact with. We should start talking to our own organizations and finding out, well, what are our policies? Under what circumstances do we conduct a police check? And if it's under all circumstances, what's considered acceptable? How long ago? What was the offense? My major concern is that as a society, I think we've decided, all right, well, there's suitable legislative sentences for any particular or given crime. If we're accepting that, that's fine. And, you know, I'm not here to argue whether it's right or wrong, too long or too short. But once that's actually been completed, I don't think we should be in a situation where we're socially excluding people for the rest of their lives. And that's what the current police check system does. So I'll go briefly into some of the things that we do and what's happening, I suppose, out in the real world of hiring at this stage. Police checks used to take a long time to process. They were reasonably expensive. It might take 2, 3, 4 weeks. They were manually processed. This is going back 20 years ago. So a lot of employers didn't bother. These days it's $50, it's online, and typically if there's nothing on it, it'll be back within a couple hours. If there is something on it, it might take a couple extra days. And often what ends up happening is employment services like ours, or employers are engaging with employment services like ours and asking for a police check up front. If we're in a situation where a police check is asked for up front, there's a really good chance, particularly if it's online hiring or online hiring practices, that the recruitment process ends there. A young person is now in the no pile. An ex-offender is now in the no pile. They see, first of all, that there's a disclosable. Before they go any further, it's easier just to say no, because then you might have to justify later why you didn't make that choice. What we do is, when we get a person come into our program, one of the first things we do is we ask them, do you think you have anything on your police check? And often they say no. And as Anushka pointed out, it might be that it was without conviction. Well, no, it's fine. It won't be there. Or it happened a while ago. So the first thing we do is say, well, look, we're happy to run a police check for you. This will never be passed to an employer if you don't want it to, but it's good for you to know. And then we can get into that stage of, okay, this is what's going to show up. Can we teach you how to self-advocate? Can we introduce you to an employer where you can tell your story? Because if the person can tell their story, I think it makes it a lot more difficult for a hiring panel to be able to say, no, now you're dealing with a person. You're not going through Seek or Ethical Jobs or whatever else, whatever other platform you're going through that has said there's a disclosable, and then you're leaving it potentially up to an HR policy or a judgment call on whether that's acceptable or not. So that's one side of it. It's teaching the self-advocacy, letting them know that your past experience doesn't define who you are now, but you will need to be able to address it. From an employer perspective, I think we need to do more. The spent convictions scheme is not enough. I think we need to really justify at what stage we're asking for a police check. I think we need to put the onus back on employers to justify, if something has come up, why that is relevant, why that is currently relevant to the job. I think there needs to be some form of format about the length of duration between when that actually occurred and what it was. And I think until we start talking about that and understanding how it actually works, as much as we can do a lot of good things with our programs, there's still going to be this glass ceiling that we can't break through. I'll leave it at that, Andrew, because I can clearly see I'm out of time. But
it was so fascinating, Rob. We wish we could keep going. In fact, I'll probably throw to you with a question in just a moment. That is a bit of a prompt to all of the people who are with us today to get your questions in now for our panelists. I will be now facilitating a panel discussion with all of our clearly extremely knowledgeable panelists on this very interesting and quite complex issue. Use the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. There's a quick one here I'll just answer straight away. Someone has asked where the stats that Anushka was referring to came from. I think you'll find the Youth Parole Board annual report quite often has stats in there about the various challenges that young people are facing, those who come into contact or come into detention, things like whether they were engaged with education, mental health services, had substance misuse, experienced abuse and trauma and things like that. So that's the Youth Parole Board annual report. You can go and check up on there. I am going to kick off because I have a lot of questions, but I will throw to audience questions as soon as they start flowing in. We've heard a lot about the spent convictions scheme there. I'm keen to dig in a little bit more into what we can do. I think, Rob, you touched on a lot of really practical things that we should be sort of demanding of our workplaces. But I'm wondering also, and maybe this is a question for you, Anushka, if there's something more structurally that needs to happen to change the way spent convictions or the way convictions are treated? Did we miss something in that latest change that we generally welcome the idea of spent convictions, but it seems like there's still a number of barriers in the way? Is there more that we can do structurally to change that, do you think?
It's an interesting question, and Rob, I think you're absolutely right to raise this as something for us to discuss, because I think fundamentally there, as a collective, there are questions about what the law currently says. Is there scope for us to change it? And if we can't change it, that what policies can we introduce across the board to mitigate and minimise the negative impacts of those policies on the people that it affects. So the spent convictions scheme at a very high level was introduced to try and address some of the hurdles and barriers faced by people who were convicted. So tick, it's great. We didn't have one. We were an outlier. We were one of the only jurisdictions that didn't have it. There's a distinction between kids and adults in terms of the length of time you, if you have a conviction and you don't offend, then it's then there's three ways that it goes away. It's either immediately spent after that period of time, 5 for kids, 10 for adults, or you have to apply. And rightly, that is for the more serious offending. So I think it's important that we're not saying that there shouldn't be any sort of controls in place. The question is, are they fair? And are there ways that we can ensure that if you are employing somebody, that we can make sure that everybody's safe, you can safely support and employ that person, notwithstanding their kind of finding of guilt. The reality is that even before, with spent convictions, even with diversion, there are certain licenses and registrations where you have to disclose whether you have ever been found guilty, even been charged. And Rob's gone through a couple, working with children, health practitioner registration, commercial vehicle driving accreditation, jobs with corrections, jobs with court services, disability, the law, and a whole range. So I think the question then is, and also there's a recent guide that the Verioc just released, commend it to all of you who are interested in this scheme in terms of what's lawful discrimination right now. So when can an employer discriminate? When can an employer ask whether you've had a conviction, and when can you actually take that into account? And so it's a really important guide for us when we're kind of adapting and ensuring that our practices are legit. But I think, going back to Rob's point, that with this system in place, I think we should look at whether we can tinker. It's quite new, so I think the reality is for us to start to advocate to change it. I don't think that's where our discretionary efforts are best placed right now. I think it's about what employers who are open-hearted and open-minded can do to kind of really openly welcome people who have got a record and try and support them to get that job, keep that job, and then actually be able to progress upwards.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anushka. Rob, it looks like you were wanting to
jump. I think there's a couple of things that are interesting. So the spent conviction scheme in its thought process is great. The difficulty is the loophole, which is that there's no guidance to an employer as to whether they can or cannot tick that box, which would be unsupervised around vulnerable people. And they can come up with their own definitions as to why, and the cost of it is no different to the cost of a regular police check. The difference is that anything you've ever done, any magistrate appearance, will come up if you tick that box. So the scariest bit is you get people thinking, oh, well, it happened 15 years ago, in dealing with youth, not likely 15 years ago. And it might be a minor, even a minor offense, and it's there. So really, yeah, we've got the spent conviction scheme, fantastic, and that needed to happen, that needed to come in place. I think what we need to view is there's specific industries, and we're all we all get confirmation bias. Everybody here is great. We all want the same thing. But it's actually a lot of the professional and the white collar jobs that are the ones that are shutting people out because they run the standard police check and look at it as risk averse. The laboring and the construction in many of those jobs, hospitality, they'll continue to be there. But as I said, we're still putting that glass ceiling on. So if we can figure out ways not to change the spent conviction scheme, but to somehow get traction with at what stage you're allowed to request a police check and or what box you're allowed to tick. And then almost perhaps just throwing it out there, affirmative hiring practices where if you've gotten to the stage where there's an offer of employment pending a police check and then a disclosable comes back, that you as an employer would have to justify why you've decided to rescind that offer of employment. I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there because I don't think the spent convictions scheme is the problem. I think it's that people are finding
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you both. I think quite clearly the intention is to allow people at some point to move on with their lives and to have success, and we're trying to find the best way to do that. And I want to just put a question to perhaps Jess and Cheryl as well. How effective, if we were to get all of that out of the way, if we were to work and to get young people into jobs and get them on a pathway, how, you've both got firsthand experience with this, how effective is that in helping young people and young adults to move forward with their lives without returning to reoffending?
Well, the example that I gave of Momentum, nobody has gone back and reoffended. And retention's been extremely high, hasn't it, Rob? We had one employer who we had a good relationship with, and his employee did go back to prison. I think the court case hadn't happened when he started work. And he was happy to make contact in whichever way the prison system allowed and reassure him that he'd have a job when he came back, when he came out. So I think we've just got to do a lot of advocacy. It's very effective because they're too busy to offend.
Jess, sorry.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of contributing factors that need to be to support a young person. So, once they're on that path to employment, and I've had that experience of getting young people into employment, and it's become a long-term routine of consistency. They're setting their own boundaries. There's a discipline there. There's a building of confidence. They gain a sense of identity. They gain an income. And with all of those positive things, it's actually a catalyst and a boost for them to continue on that path. And that's what I've found. So 2 of my young people out of those 4 that were employed full-time this year have completed their youth justice orders and remained in the community and stayed out of reoffending. So there is opportunity all the time for that to happen, but it takes a number of things. Some of those things are having good relationships in the community with other networks. We use Reconnect quite a lot, which is JSS as well, which is SORT. So we use a Reconnect program because they're able to support our young people that have been in the youth justice system, and they're able to help them with training, employment and education. So it's about building those relationships around our young people that we work with, but it definitely has a positive outcome that's more towards long-term once they get into the routine of being employed. And it opens up other opportunities for them and exposes them to other peer groups, to other positive activities in the community. So it is really a positive pathway if they can get onto employment or education of some type.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from Lee, who's asked if anyone on the panel here has had any success in having articles about a young person once they're over 18, had their name removed from historic media reporting pertaining to a historical crime. So I guess that's a really interesting point, that we've got the convictions, the sort of spent convictions that can perhaps erase that, but we're living in a world now where everything's on the internet forever and a day. So are we able to find ways to address that, or do we just need to accept it and find a way to live with it?
I can start. Can you, Andrew, can you repeat the question? Is the question about whether when they're under 18?
It says, has anyone had any success in having articles about a young person over 18?
Okay.
I guess the idea being that you'll be named in the media if you are over 18, where often, though it doesn't always happen this way, because unfortunately the media seems to name people more often than it should. But I guess sometimes when you're under 18, your name is withheld.
Well, I think there's a gap. I think the question, there's a clear gap, because in under 18, there is protection in the Act, Section 534, if people want to know that, to make sure that you're not allowed to name or identify a young person who's got court charges. The problem with that is that it talks very specifically about once the charges are in the court. So then there's that gap beforehand, and quite often Crime Stoppers, social media, dash cam, doorbell cam, street cam means that the news is out, your images are out, and then it's very difficult to unwind that once it's out there, which is I think what your questioner is kind of alluding to. There's no protection in relation to the over 18s, and it's something to think about, certainly in terms of advocacy, to ask for a similar protection for, say, the 18 to 25-year-olds, just because they're still developing, because they're still considered young people, and it's just so damaging, you know, in terms of your professional, you know, kind of reputation and ability to rehabilitate.
Yeah. Thanks, Anushka. Anyone else want to address that one, or no one's come across it?
Yeah, I suppose at the very least, I'll mention what a huge problem it is, and we're probably reasonably aware of it. But we had a young person that we placed 3 different times amongst employers who are willing to look past what had happened. But it was a relatively, you know, high media level case, and it was actually his coworkers that 3 times effectively went then and told the employer that, you know, either he goes or we go. And that didn't just happen in the workplace. We were doing a lot of background support, saying, look, what things did you like to do beforehand? Go join a local footy club. Joined, was feeling great. Things were looking up. 3 weeks in, his coach pulled him into the office and said, you got to go. Like, so these things that, you know, the media, the harrowing story, you know, just somebody trying to get past it, trying to do all the right things. And as you said, the media exposure just kept catching up to him. It did end well. He ended up with long-term employment, but geez, it was a really rocky ride there.
Yeah. And we also had the participant who we placed, whose father had the same name.
Yeah.
And the father was a bit of a gangster. And we had to do a little bit of quick talking with the employer on that as well. He was an absolute, he had no criminal record, the person that we placed. He just had the same name of his father who'd been murdered.
Yeah, so it's very real. It's very real, and it has major implications on people's employment and social and mental health well-being.
Thank you. Cheryl, I actually did want to go to you next anyway and ask, in your experience working directly with employers, when they are hesitant, or when they, you know, what sorts of concerns do they have? Is there trust concerns? Is there other concerns that you need to work with them to overcome, and how do you do that before you can get them to hire people with a past criminal record?
I think one of their concerns is how it would impact on their business. But, you know, in the construction space, will other people find out about it? So we've just encouraged them to keep confidentiality so that people can be judged on their own merits. And they've got to take that leap of faith and give trust, and often that's returned if they do. So I think we've got a big role to play in it as well, and maybe have a chat to them about what their convictions were, like have the conversation, like is it even relevant to their job? Somebody, you know, got done for drink driving 5 years ago. Their job doesn't involve driving, so is that relevant, you know?
Yep. Okay, fantastic, thank you. We have another question here from John Wickham. I mentioned earlier that only 1 in 5 people leave prison into employment. I think that's actually an adult statistic, but the question here is, you know, if anyone on the panel, and I don't know, Jess, if you wanted to have a shot at this one, or if anyone else has some insight into what's leading to that, what's stopping people from having employment upon release. Is there a disconnect between what's happening in prison, getting people ready to transition out of prison into employment and housing and all those things they need? Is there simply the stigma that we've been talking about and the hard work that needs to happen to address that and to find trusted employers and relationships, combination of the things? Anything else happening there?
I think just reconnection back into, integrating back into the community is one big thing for young people. For many of them, they've come from circumstances even within their family, and they've gone into custody. And when they've been released, they've gone back into the same environment with all the same issues they had prior to going into custody. So it's really about them reconnecting back into the community, and that's where I suppose our advocacy skills and support help with trying to reconnect young people to the community. But yeah, a lot of the issues are around that reconnection that they don't have and going back in. A lot of it's, lack of confidence, like, their education experience they had was often negative, and they hadn't had an engaged education for quite some time. Many of our young people have dropped out of school during the years 8 and 9. So they haven't had any engagement for a long time. And so that lacks confidence to be able to re-engage. So a lot of it's reconnecting as well. And so that's where support's needed big time to be able to connect and link them back into the community.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anyone else want to address some of those challenges?
Yeah, Andrew, we recently, West Justice has a terrific youth employment program where they deliver legal services to young people about their work rights and responsibilities. And they did a report, Ignorance is Not Bliss. And one of the findings, there's a couple of findings, but they found that young people aren't equipped or aren't being equipped with the right knowledge or tools to be ready for work. So these are the same young people who are then, is exactly what Jess was talking about. So they didn't have the skills and equipment going in. So the idea that they're going to miraculously be ready to get get a job, having spent time in custody with other young people who've got the same issues, that just doesn't seem like the right setting to be able to really get them job ready. Then it's all of those micro issues that Rob and Cheryl and Jess have kind of really stepped out. Like we were doing a workshop the other day with some colleagues in the West, and they were talking about one of the things that they've noticed is that there's not even a clear clarity around who is actually going to transport a young person when they leave custody, in terms of who's going to get them home. So those sorts of things need to be they seem obvious. We can't assume anything, and that's why it's great that you've got these programs kind of working in concert, because that's exactly the level of support that's required on a micro and macro scale to help kids get the job. Also, because one of the things that we also found is that a lot of young people who can then get a job are subject to workplace exploitation, cash in hand work, and kind of really being in conditions that aren't ideal. Then then they're reluctant to say anything because you're lucky to get a job even. And so these are some of the kind of issues I suspect that young people are experiencing on entry, also they're experiencing on exit. And one of the other things is that, we talked about youth unemployment. That rate is higher for young people from multicultural backgrounds. And they're also, part of that is the fact that their parents were also finding it difficult to attain work. So they're in terms of part of that equipment and being job ready is role modeling, knowing what to do, knowing what to ask, knowing how to self-advocate. And they haven't, because their parents haven't had those opportunities, they then are not able to have those opportunities as well.
Fantastic. I'll just encourage people, we do have time for a few more questions. So if you've got anything you wanted to ask the panel, you're running out of time to ask your questions, so I get it in soon. We do have a really great spread of very experienced and knowledgeable people here, so get in with your questions. And while you're doing that, I wanted to ask Cheryl, you talked a little bit earlier about Randall from Momentum going into the prison at some point, I think, and you talked a bit, I think, about people getting ready for release, or perhaps, is there things that you're able to help people do so that that transition from prison, hopefully into employment, can happen smoothly at the moment?
Well, I think some of it starts in prison. I think prisons that have good training programs in place where people come out with some skills so the time's not wasted. And that was something that Randall encouraged them to do. And, they've got to come out and get the first job, then they've got a referee, for the next job. It really doesn't have to be a high-level job. It's get a job, get a reference. If we get someone who doesn't have skills and training, we put them into training. Like the young lady that first started with Randall, it was 6 weeks, I think, between registering with our service, getting her into a white card, a traffic control course. Then she got the job. Then we got her into doing a rail course. And then there was a lot of support that was needed. A lot happened in the background, but both to the employer and the employee, because sometimes they don't know how to manage someone. And, we've had people become homeless while they're working. We've had nearly every situation, family problems come up, but it's, communication's vital. I'm not actually sure if I've answered your question properly, but I think some of it needs to start before they come out.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what I was getting at, was wondering whether we're failing people, broadly speaking, as a community, by not preparing for that transition out of prison back into the community in a way that could set people up for success, really. Understanding there's still a lot of challenges that people will face, but trying to make that at least as achievable as possible. All right, so there's a few more questions here I wanted to get to. I guess one thing, part of Worth Second Chance is about how, again, us as a community, how the broader community can sort of support and help young people to get their lives on track. And so I guess in this space, what can the broader community be doing? What can those who are interested in seeing our young people take accountability for for the mistakes they've made in the past, for the actions they've made, and move forward positively? Anushka, perhaps to you, how can the community be engaged with this in ways that can be positive and help us move forward?
In relation to the employment domain specifically, or more broadly?
I think what we're uncovering is that, to help young people be successful in employment, to have a positive pathway, there's a range of things perhaps we need to be doing, and whether that's, I think that example that you had, Rob, even of, not necessarily being the workplace that had an issue with someone's criminal past or their criminal offending, but it was the social environment or the workmates that then sort of said, well, we don't want this person here. How do we overcome that? How do we address that as a community more broadly so that we do support people to move forward with their lives?
It's an interesting, it's a good question. It's the question that we need to ask and keep asking. And I think we need to ask, I think the best way to start is by actually asking employers, asking people what the barriers are, and finding out, and kind of, because people, it makes sense that people will have concerns and fears and kind of reservations. And so then there's a question about whether we can meet in the middle and whether we can support them to overcome it. Because one of the things, we were talking about helping kids be, young people be job ready in custody. Then I think it's about the great work that you're doing and kind of continuing that work to help employers and also staff there to help kind of accept and understand young people who have been, kind of involved in the system, and kind of breaking down barriers, understand what those barriers may be to begin with by speaking to the people who are likely to be impacted by it, and starting there.
Fantastic, thank you. Rob, any insights from you from working with that particular person? And you said it ended well. Finally, there was obviously a place where that person was able to sort of move forward from that past, or at least be in an environment that was a bit more broadly accepting. Was there something that changed, or was there any learnings from that?
Look, to be perfectly honest, it wasn't so much of a change. I mean, it's still out there. This person would still be at risk at any time of somebody discovering. I suppose the only hope you can give somebody is, and we do an awful lot of work with this, and particularly with this person that I was referencing earlier, because as I said, it was quite a harrowing story, is you need to stick with it. You can't let what you've done in your past define who you are today. And yes, this is going to happen. It's probably going to happen perhaps for many years, but the further distance you put between yourself, who you are now, and what happened, and that can be sticking to the path, that can be education, that can be continuous employment. As much as it sounds ridiculous to say, just keep pushing along and it will get better. That's all we can do. We walk alongside them. There were times where we thought we were going to lose him, like genuinely lose him. But he kept at it. And so I think one of the things that is the key ingredient to all of this, and I don't know how we get this across, because there was a question saying, you know, how do we get people jobs as they leave the prison system? This young man that I was referencing was one of the most motivated people, remorseful, just wanted to put it behind him, wanted to get on with his life. So he kept at it. And you know, we mentioned that there's a lot of people coming from generational unemployment, usually due to discrimination as well. So they don't have anybody who says like, yep, this is the way to get past it. It's not as simple as saying the person's come out of jail, they say, I want to work, and you put them in a job. There's so much more that's going on behind, and they need those supports, whether it's from the community, whether it's from someone like Jessamine, whether it's from an employer or a mentor and employment program. We have to keep at it. We have to keep them feeling like there's some form of hope. So for me, that's all we can do. We can never remove that, but hopefully we can remove a few of the obstacles along the way, so that each step they go, well, at least I got a job. I mean, that's a start. You know, maybe I can get another one. You know, can you guide me through it? What happened? I don't think we're going to be able to change the general societal stance, but I think that, you know, giving hope to that person is probably the biggest thing we can do.
Well, Rob, I think you've actually summed up a lot of what we've been talking about today really well. I think we might even just sort of draw a line under it there. I think sticking with people, giving people hope. You know, this campaign is called Worth a Second Chance. We talked about when we launched the campaign that it could be called Worth a Second Chance, a third chance, a fourth chance, a fifth chance, and more, you know, until we finally see the success that we want to see. I'm going to wrap up unless any of the panelists have something else burning that they wanted to mention before we do wrap up. No.
Can I just say one? Can I think I reckon, to Rob's point about we can't change societal attitudes, I think we can, is the short of it. So I think one of the great, I always say this, but I'm going to say it again, one of the things that, you know, one of the many things that Jesuits do well is restorative justice, and kind of, you know, that kind of the conferencing, and, you know, I think that there's more to kind of be done in that space to kind of really kind of overcome the barriers and the stigmas that make it very hard to reintegrate effectively, and that is a really important part. And I think it's something in terms of changing attitudes and understanding that this is another person. It could have been you could have made one extra really bad decision that day, but for all of the supports in place, you're actually the same people, like kind of really kind of deepening an understanding between the two people, and kind of really starting to share experiences. I think that's one part. The other thing I think also which is within our infinite reach is that issue of systemic discrimination, and looking at all of those different systemic barriers. So it's not a matter of how this person has got into the trouble or why they can't get a job, but actually no wonder, and what we can do in the sector, in the collective sectors, to kind of advocate to reduce and ideally end those systemic barriers.
Thank you, Anushka. All right, well, that pretty much brings us to the end of our webinar today. I want to deeply thank all of our panelists who are with us today. It was a really engaging and illuminating conversation around some of the challenges that young people face when they've had contact with the criminal justice system, but I guess the opportunities too, in terms for them, for employers, but also for the broader community in terms of sort of allowing them to take responsibility for the past, but to move forward positively, and you know, what a positive experience that can be for everyone. Worth Second Chance is a campaign of Jesuit Social Services that seeks to continue this work, continue these conversations, to break down some of these barriers, to help people understand the lived experience of young people who have had contact with the criminal justice system, and to understand how they can best move forward and have a real transformative experience, not just for themselves, but for others around them as well. We would, for those of you who are not engaged with Worth Second Chance at the moment, we would love you to consider taking some action, and for everyone here actually to consider taking some action after today's webinar. So there are three simple ways you can get involved. Going along to the Worth Second Chance website, which you can see there, worthasecondchance.com.au. You can sign up to become a supporter of the campaign, which means you will get our monthly bulletin. You'll be kept up to date with things like events that are coming up, but also with actions that we're taking. You'll get access to a lot of sort of stats and materials and stories and the personal lived experience of a lot of young people that we work with. The other thing you can do is consider sharing our content on social media as well. So if you head along to either Instagram, Twitter or Facebook, you can see our address there is Worth a Second Chance. On any of those platforms, it's always the same address. And finally, I think if there's anyone who is an employer who's with us today on this webinar, and you think you want to potentially see what it would look like to become involved in helping someone with a past criminal history move forward into employment, then you can contact us on that address that's on your screen there, employmentservices@jss.org.au. So that's pretty much everything for today. Finally, I do really want to thank Mustafa as well, who I don't believe is with us on the webinar, but you know, was very courageous and very generous in sharing his story with us. And I think that really set the scene for what was a fantastic discussion and really reminded us of what's at stake here. It's people like Mustafa who has got a lot to offer and wants to be included, wants to take part and wants to move forward with his life. Thanks everyone for being with us today and have a good evening.